August 12, 1944. Northern France, midnight. Allied radar stations from Dover to Amiens track over 300 bombers returning from a strike near Hamburg. One by one, their signals appear as green blips across the scopes, except for one. Black 13. It vanishes. No explosion. No mayday. No trace. The operator at RAF Ventnor leans forward, taps the glass and mutters, "She's gone." A faint echo lingers for a heartbeat, then silence swallows the screen. Somewhere over the dark fields below, a 4-engine bomber carrying 10 men has simply ceased to exist. At dawn, crews at RAF Lisset gather around the empty parking space on the tarmac. The chalk outline of B-24 Black 13 stares back at them. Its maintenance team looks nervous. Someone mutters, "They shouldn't have flown painted like that." The bomber had been different. Every inch of aluminum drowned in matte black paint. Not just the fuselage, but the propellers, the nose art, even the national insignia. The ground chief had objected. "Sir, command says reflective silver's mandatory for identification." Captain Luke Reaper Hanlon had smiled and said, "That's why we're still being shot down." He'd done it anyway. Every pilot on the base knew what the regulations said. No unauthorized modifications, no unapproved coatings. But for men flying into flak every night, regulations didn't stop bullets. Hanlon's crew wanted to survive, not comply. And for 22 straight missions, they did. They flew where others fell. They returned when whole squadrons vanished. They were ghosts with engines, the black ship that came back. Then, on their 23rd run, they didn't. Within hours, rumors spread like wildfire. Some said they'd been shot down by friendly fire, mistaken for a German plane. Others whispered that the enemy never saw them coming, and they'd gone too deep behind enemy lines. The most superstitious claimed something stranger. Black 13 had slipped the radar grid entirely, vanished into the night like a shadow swallowed by its own darkness. By the second day, the story had already become legend. The bomber with no reflection. The crew that defied the rules and gravity itself. At headquarters, officers were furious. "They painted the entire ship black? Without clearance?" "Yes, sir," a mechanic replied quietly. Said the paint was their only armor. When intelligence teams reviewed Luftwaffe intercept logs from that night, they found no record of radar contact with any unmarked bomber. It was as if Hanlon's B-24 had flown through an invisible corridor in the sky, untouched, undetected, and ultimately untraceable. For weeks, search planes combed the countryside. Nothing. No crash site, no wreckage, no parachutes, just whispers from French farmers who claimed to have seen a dark shape gliding silently across the moon before dawn. By winter, Black 13 was officially listed as missing cause unknown. But within the barracks, the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. Hanlon's crew hadn't been crazy. They'd been right. The paint worked. It dulled reflections. It confused radar. It absorbed light. In their quest to survive, they had stumbled into the first primitive form of stealth aviation. 30 years before the world would name it that. And while official reports buried the story, the legend endured among pilots who whispered it in mess halls and over runways. The crew that turned a bomber into a shadow and paid the price for flying invisible. For the men who heard the story, Black 13 became more than a missing plane. It became a myth. By the fall of 1944, every bomber group in England had its own version. Some said the B-24 had been swallowed by a thunderstorm that scrambled radar. Others swore it was a secret experiment by the OSS, testing invisibility paint. In the smoke-filled pubs around Norwich and Cambridge, airmen spoke of the invisible squadron. A handful of bombers that could slip through searchlights, vanish from radar, and strike deep into the Reich unseen. It was nonsense, command insisted. You can't paint your way off a radar scope. But the more they denied it, the more the rumor spread. Superstition thrived where survival rates collapsed. By late 44, the average bomber crew faced a 1 in 3 chance of making it through their tour alive. Fear filled the gaps that science hadn't yet explained. To some, the black plains represented madness, men cracking under pressure. To others, they represented hope, proof that survival was still possible if you dared to break the rules. At briefing tables, commanders scoffed. "We fight with engines and discipline, not fairy tales." But in the hangars, mechanics quietly mixed matte paint under the cover of night. Some used coal dust. Others melted shoe polish into varnish. Regulations meant nothing to men who'd seen their friends burn in daylight. One navigator, interviewed years later, said, "When you fly long enough, reason starts to sound like arrogance. Those black planes weren't crazy, they were desperate. And desperate men survive." But the deeper truth, the one no one spoke aloud, was that something had changed after Black 13. Radar logs began showing brief gaps during night raids, fleeting black holes where echoes disappeared for seconds at a time. Analysts chalked it up to interference. Yet the pattern matched the altitudes and routes of certain B-24 squadrons rumored to have borrowed the black coating trick. When the British Air Ministry reviewed reports, one note stood out. "Unconfirmed, the matte black finish appears to reduce reflectivity under certain wavelengths." That single sentence, buried in a file labeled classified, experimental paint tests, was the quiet start of an idea decades ahead of its time. Still, the culture around it stayed tangled in myth. Pilots whispered about cursed planes, ghost crews, and bombers that disappeared because they'd made themselves too invisible, even to their own side. A story that once began with defiance turned into a cautionary tale. The price of playing God with physics. For Hanlon's fellow airmen, that legend became both warning and inspiration. They painted small panels black for luck, or daubed soot along the leading edges of their wings. They didn't know why it worked. They just knew it felt like control, a way to cheat the odds in a war that had turned life into mathematics. Back at Lisset, the mechanics who'd helped Hanlon stayed silent during investigations. None confessed. But in the months that followed, their bombers suffered fewer intercepts. The mad paint job, as one colonel sneered, might have been superstition, or it might have been science that headquarters wasn't ready to understand. For now, the myth remained untouchable. The official story said Black 13 was lost in action. Unofficially, it had become the most feared and admired bomber in Europe. No one could prove it existed. No one could prove it didn't. And in that uncertainty between fear and fact, the legend of the invisible bomber grew stronger than any truth. By the summer of 1944, the night skies over Europe had turned into a technological battlefield. Radar waves, jamming signals, and countermeasures pulsed invisibly between the clouds, each side racing to see before being seen. The days of open-sky dogfights were fading. Now, war was fought by invisible eyes. Germany had perfected the Kammhuber line, an overlapping grid of radar zones that blanketed Western Europe. At its core was the Liechtenstein Fug 2 and 20, a night fighter radar mounted on twin-engine interceptors like the Bf-110. These hunters didn't need to see their prey. They only needed a faint radar echo, a whisper of metal reflecting waves from miles away. Once detected, anti-aircraft flak and night fighters would swarm the bombers in minutes. The Allies responded with brute force. More bombers, more flak suppression, more jammers. But the math didn't lie. Radar-directed interception increased Luftwaffe kill ratios by 40% in a single year. Pilots could feel the system closing around them. Each night, men watched formation lights vanish in sudden bursts of flame, knowing the enemy never saw them with eyes, only with machines. In Britain, a parallel war took shape, a shadow war led by the Special Operations Executive. Their flights, known as carpetbagger missions, ran deep into occupied France, dropping agents and supplies to the resistance. These planes were painted matte black, stripped of markings, engines tuned to run quieter. Their goal was simple: become ghosts. Captain Luke Reaper Hanlon wasn't part of that unit, but he'd heard their stories, how their black planes seemed to slip through radar screens like phantoms. Officially, his B-24 belonged to a daylight bombing squadron of the 8th Air Force. But night missions were increasing, targets were shifting, and the Luftwaffe's radar claws were finding them even in darkness. At the base, Hanlon studied the mission reports. Crews that flew low returned. Crews that flew predictable routes vanished. Radar-directed intercepts accounted for 3/4 of losses. He drew a conclusion few dared to speak aloud. If radar sees reflections, then reflections are our enemy. To headquarters, the answer was more technology. Heavier jamming gear, bigger chaff dispensers, specialized crews. But to Hanlon, every pound added meant slower climbs, shorter range, less survival. He didn't want more machinery. He wanted less reflection. His crew thought he'd lost it when he proposed painting the plane black. "Sir, command will have our heads." "Command's already lost half its squadrons," Hanlon replied. "We'll try something different." The logic was primitive but brilliant. Radar wasn't magic. It was math, radio waves bouncing off metal. Paint couldn't make a bomber invisible, but it could reduce signal return. Every percent mattered when the difference between detection and disappearance was seconds. The British had already proven the concept worked, though quietly. Carpetbagger crews flying black B-24s recorded drastically fewer intercepts. The difference? Their paint absorbed more radar energy and scattered the rest unevenly, confusing enemy operators. But such operations were classified. Hanlon had no clearance, no permission, and no guarantee his version would work. Still, he acted. The mechanics who helped him mixed industrial soot, fuel oil, and matte enamel into a homemade blend. The airfield reeked of chemicals for days. When inspectors visited, the crew covered the bomber with tarps and claimed engine repairs. When the tarps came off, Black 13 was born, a rebellion with wings. That night, as he stood before his freshly painted bomber, Hanlon said quietly to his co-pilot, "They can have their radar. I'll take the dark." It was a statement both defiant and prophetic. In a war obsessed with illumination, tracer fire, flares, searchlights, Hanlon had chosen the one ally no one else trusted: darkness, and it would keep him alive longer than anyone expected. By the summer of 1944, the air war over Europe had become a war of arithmetic, brutal, relentless, and personal. Every bomber crew lived by numbers because numbers decided who lived and who didn't. At briefing tables, officers rarely talked about courage anymore. They talked about percentages. A daylight bombing mission carried a 4% chance of being shot down. Fly 25 missions, and that 4% turned into near certainty. Crews learned to do the grim math in their heads. We've got about 6 more flights before luck runs out. Of all Allied losses that year, 3/4 were caused by radar-guided defenses. Not luck, not ambushes, but equations. The precision of German tracking arrays that could spot an unpainted B-24 from 40 miles away. By mid-1944, more than 30,000 Allied airmen were missing or killed, many within minutes of crossing the French coast. Every mission began with a silent ritual, each man touching the tail before boarding, as if it might be the last time. And Hanlon? He was tired of being a number. The official radar jamming solution, the carpet system, weighed nearly 400 pounds. It cluttered the fuselage and burned out generators. It was expensive, complex, and unreliable. Hanlon looked at his bomber, 40,000 pounds of aluminum, and saw the real problem: shine. Radar was simple physics. Radio waves bounced off reflective surfaces. Bare aluminum acted like a mirror to the German scopes. If those reflections were absorbed, dispersed, or dulled, radar returns would weaken. He scribbled the math in his notebook. Radar reflectivity surface polish, X area, X angle of incidence. His conclusion was blunt. If we can't hide the plane, we can confuse the reflection. That's when the paint idea stopped being crazy and became inevitable. Hanlon's mechanic, Corporal Jules Ferris, recalled it years later. He wasn't talking about camouflage. He was talking about science, about turning the bomber into a shape the enemy radar couldn't read. The irony was bitter. The same Air Force that insisted on shiny aluminum to reflect sunlight for formation visibility had created the perfect radar target. Their logic: better to risk night fighters than mid-air collisions. Hanlon disagreed. You can't collide if you never get found. In his logbook, next to the mission tallies, Hanlon began jotting fragments of data from returning crews. Altitude versus intercept time. Paint color versus detection. He wasn't just flying missions. He was collecting evidence. The results were terrifyingly consistent. Aluminum-finished bombers, detected within 8 to 12 minutes of entering German radar range. Soot-darkened or oil-streaked aircraft, delayed detection by 2 to 4 minutes. Black-painted fuselage, rare. Up to 6 minutes of radar silence, 6 minutes. In a sky crawling with night fighters, 6 minutes was survival. Every second counted. At 250 miles/hour, a bomber traveled 4 miles per minute. 6 minutes meant 24 miles, enough to cross a flak belt, drop payloads, and turn for home before the enemy even scrambled. When Hanlon presented his data to the squadron adjutant, the officer laughed. "You're telling me black paint beats German radar?" Hanlon didn't flinch. "I'm telling you math does." It wasn't bravado. It was desperation with logic. Behind the numbers lay a simple truth that no one wanted to admit. America's air power was winning by mass, not by efficiency. For every B-24 that returned, another was lost. Hanlon's experiment wasn't about disobedience. It was about survival. Each coat of matte paint brushed onto Black 13 wasn't rebellion. It was insurance. Insurance bought not with money, but with science, and with the lives of men who refused to be part of the casualty statistics. And when the math of destruction threatened to consume them all, Hanlon decided to rewrite the equation himself. It began like every other mission, except no one could quite meet Hanlon's eyes. When Black 13 rolled onto the runway at Lisset, the ground crew stood in silence. Under the faint moonlight, the bomber looked unnatural, a shadow given shape. Every surface swallowed light instead of reflecting it. Even the squadron mascot, a collie named Duke, refused to go near it. One mechanic muttered, "Looks like the devil's own plane." Hanlon climbed the ladder without a word. His crew followed, half believers, half skeptics. "Sir," the navigator whispered, "if this works, we'll owe you a drink. If it doesn't," Hanlon cut him off. "Then nobody'll be around to collect." Engines roared to life, low and throaty. The matte black paint dulled the reflection of the flames. From the control tower, the plane was barely visible against the night sky. The radio crackled once. "Godspeed, Reaper." Then silence. At 2200 hours, they crossed the French coast. This was where radar screens usually lit up. German operators would radio intercept vectors within seconds. Tonight, nothing. No flares, no searchlights, just darkness and the dull hum of engines. The bombardier watched his instruments, waiting for the alarm. None came. "Where's the flak?" he asked. Hanlon just smiled. "Maybe they're still looking." 2 minutes passed, then 5. Still no contact. In the Luftwaffe control bunker near Le Havre, an operator scribbled a note. "Radar contact lost. Intermittent echo. Possibly storm interference." Another technician swore and slapped the side of the screen. "They're ghosts again." Back in Black 13, the altimeter ticked down. 15,000 feet. 12,000. They were right over the target zone, a rail junction feeding German armor to Normandy. Still, no anti-aircraft bursts. "Drop zone confirmed," called the bombardier. "Doors open," Hanlon ordered. The payload released cleanly, 4,500-pound bombs sliding into the dark. The sky stayed silent. No tracer fire. No alarm. The radio operator stared in disbelief. "We're ghosts," he whispered. The crew didn't cheer. They didn't dare. Every man on board felt something uncanny. Not relief, but disbelief. For the first time in months, a mission had gone perfectly quiet. The return flight felt longer. They expected fighters to pounce at any second. But the German radar never reacquired them. They crossed the channel before anyone fired a single shot. When they landed, the control tower was already blinking with Morse. A message from command. "Report immediately. You were never cleared for departure." They'd slipped out under false orders, falsified by a sympathetic adjutant who believed in Hanlon's experiment. Technically, they'd committed treason. But treason had just brought home an entire crew. The next morning, engineers from headquarters surrounded the bomber. They ran their hands along the fuselage, shaking their heads. "Paint can't do this," one said. Hanlon shrugged. Then maybe it wasn't the paint. Unofficially, flight logs showed a 6-minute radar gap at exactly the window of their route. No German night fighters scrambled. No flak units reported contact. It was as if Black 13 had never existed. Word spread fast. Crews in nearby squadrons began smuggling paint from supply depots. Mechanics mixed their own concoctions. Soon, black streaks and matte patches appeared across airfields in England. Quiet acts of defiance inspired by a single night's success. Official orders banned it immediately. Unauthorized coatings compromise identification and maintenance protocols. But the ban came too late. The idea had escaped containment. Hanlon knew the experiment had worked, but it had also doomed him. Command wanted control, not miracles that couldn't be explained. When he received his summons to headquarters, his crew begged him not to go. Hanlon just smiled. "Don't worry, they can't court-martial a ghost." For a brief, glorious week, Black 13 became a legend whispered in hangars and flight tents across England. Crews from the 466th, 93rd, and 448th bomb groups came to see it with their own eyes. A matte black B-24 that had flown straight through German airspace without a single bullet hole. To them, it wasn't witchcraft. It was salvation. But to headquarters, it was an accounting error waiting to happen. On July 12, 1944, 2 men from 8th Air Force Engineering Command arrived at Lisset, their uniforms starched, their clipboards heavier than their expressions. They asked no questions at first. They only circled the bomber, tapping the fuselage with metal calipers, scraping a bit of paint into a vial, jotting down numbers like surgeons measuring a body before autopsy. Hanlon waited until they were done. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "did we do something wrong?" One of them looked up. "Captain, this plane violates maintenance standards, serial visibility requirements, and chemical coating policy number 42B. "Did it violate German radar?" Hanlon shot back. No one answered. By nightfall, his bomber had been grounded. Officially, it was for safety testing. Unofficially, Hanlon had embarrassed a system that couldn't explain how a handful of mechanics had achieved what a dozen laboratories and millions in funding had not. The irony was mathematical and cruel. His black paint had worked too well. Tests from the engineering unit confirmed the coating reduced radar cross-section by nearly 20%. But the material, a mix of carbon soot, oil, and matte enamel, trapped heat. At altitude, thermal expansion caused micro-cracks along the skin of the fuselage. Tiny fissures, invisible to the eye, could spread under pressure. The paint didn't kill the bomber, but it scared the engineers who didn't understand it. They called it collapse math. The same properties that absorbed radar waves also absorbed heat, distorting metal over time. Innovative but unstable, the report read, potentially catastrophic under prolonged exposure. For Hanlon, it was both vindication and damnation. He'd proven a point, and that point was now buried under technical language. At the next briefing, the colonel in charge didn't mince words. "Captain Hanlon, the Air Force appreciates your creativity. But we have procedures for a reason. You'll remove the coating immediately. Hanlon's jaw tightened. Sir, you're grounding what might be the safest plane in Europe. You're grounded too, Captain. Effective immediately. The decision spread faster than the results. To the brass, it wasn't about science, it was about control. If innovation came from below, the system lost authority. In the mess hall that night, Hanlon's crew sat in silence. Their success, 6 minutes of invisibility, a mission with 0 losses, meant nothing now. The new directive made it clear. No unauthorized alterations to aircraft surfaces. Mechanic Jules Ferris slammed his mug on the table. We made her invisible. They're killing her because she worked. Hanlon only nodded. That's the problem. She worked, and she wasn't theirs. Over the next few days, ground crews stripped Black 13 back to factory silver. The process took hours. The smell of solvent filled the air. Sharp, chemical, final. As the black paint peeled away, the bomber seemed to fade not into the sky this time, but into bureaucracy. When it was done, Hanlon walked around the plane one last time. His fingertips came away silver. Shiny again, he muttered. Perfect for radar. That night, the base lost 3 bombers to flak. All standard finish, all visible from 40 miles out. And though no one dared say it out loud, every man who'd seen Black 13 fly knew what the reports would never admit. The numbers had changed, but the truth hadn't. Innovation had a cost, and the system had decided it was too expensive to pay. 2 weeks after Hanlon's grounding, the war thundered toward its bloodiest summer. Operation Cobra was underway in Normandy, and the 8th Air Force faced brutal losses over Berlin. The flak corridors were so dense that veteran crews described them as flying through a thunderstorm made of metal. Hanlon was supposed to be on maintenance duty. Paperwork, parts requisitions, the kind of quiet punishment designed to bury ambition. But war doesn't wait for bureaucracy. When a replacement bomber crew arrived short on pilots and desperate for navigational support, someone at Lisset made a mistake that would turn into a legend. At dawn, Black 13 rolled onto the tarmac again. Not its old self, but not quite factory standard either. Under the pale light, faint streaks of darkness shimmered beneath the new silver paint. Someone, no one ever admitted who, had mixed soot into the final coating, leaving a faint matte hue visible only up close. Hanlon stood by the wing, helmet under his arm. The new crew chief asked, "You ever flown Berlin before?" Hanlon smiled faintly. "Once. They didn't see me." The mission that day was straightforward. Hit the Siemens Schuckert works, an industrial complex churning out parts for Germany's jet fighters. But the weather was bad, the radar worse. Command nearly scrubbed the mission. Hanlon volunteered to take the navigator's seat. As Black 13 climbed into formation, the skies above the channel glowed with sunlight. By the time they reached Germany, everything turned gray. Clouds thick, air heavy, and lightning flickering through the haze. Then came the voice on the intercom. "Enemy radar has us. Flak at 12 o'clock. But nothing appeared. No tracer fire, no bursts. Just silence. At 21,000 feet, Hanlon adjusted the drift correction manually. Something felt off. Not in the instruments, but in the air. He looked out the window and realized why. The light. The silver bombers ahead gleamed like fish scales. But Black 13 looked wrong. Dim. Almost invisible against the storm clouds. A few minutes later, radio chatter exploded across the net. "Lead group taking hits, multiple bursts." Hanlon's bomber, a few hundred feet lower, remained untouched. They broke formation as planned. "Target ahead," the bombardier called. "Visual confirmation. Factory complex in sight." Hanlon adjusted altitude again. 15,000 feet, then 14,000. The flak still hadn't found them. Bomb doors opened. Payload away. Then something extraordinary happened. From below, spotlights sliced through the clouds, searching, sweeping, blind. The German gunners were firing wildly, unsure where the ghost had come from. Radar crews near Berlin later reported a missing contact. One bomber visible on optical sighting but not on radar. The only explanation offered, atmospheric distortion. But to the men aboard Black 13, it was something else entirely. When they turned for home, they passed through the burning horizon, a sky alive with chaos. American bombers were scattered, pursued, shredded. Yet somehow Black 13 drifted untouched. Hanlon didn't speak. He simply stared at the controls, the gauges steady, the engines smooth. The crew was silent too, not out of fear, but reverence. 6 hours later, they landed safely at Lisette, last in, but whole. The next morning, a message arrived from headquarters. Captain Hanlon is hereby reassigned to administrative duties effective immediately. No commendation, no inquiry, just silence. But among the crews, whispers began. Someone painted a small black 13 on a hangar door. Someone else left a note. The ghost still flies. By the end of the war, every squadron had heard the story of a bomber that vanished from radar, flew through Berlin's flak unscathed, and returned when everyone said it couldn't. Officially, Black 13 was logged as standard issue, unmodified. Unofficially, it became a myth, a legend about one mad crew, one outlaw idea, and a sky that couldn't hold their shadow. They called it Mission 23. The number alone made crews uneasy. Too close to superstition, too far from the safety of a completed tour. For Captain William Hanlon, it was supposed to be his last combat flight, a quiet escort assignment for a new pilot over occupied France. But nothing about Hanlon's career had ever been quiet. By now, the war was turning. Allied armor was cutting through Normandy, and the Luftwaffe was fighting in desperation. Yet the skies were still deadly, and the ghost of Black 13 had become both miracle and curse. Command had never acknowledged its success, but they also couldn't ignore that no bomber flown by Hanlon had ever been lost. When he volunteered for one final mission, no one questioned it. The new pilot, Lieutenant Carter, was 23 years old, fresh from flight school. His voice trembled on the intercom. "Sir, they told me this is your good luck run." Hanlon chuckled. "Luck's just math, son. You do the numbers right. You live." But as the convoy of bombers took off from Lisette that dawn, there was something different about Hanlon's plane. The mechanics had found leftover barrels of dulling compound, a modified, regulation-approved version of his old formula. Quietly, without orders, they'd added a thin coat across the fuselage. Just enough to take the shine off, just enough to whisper rebellion. The target that morning was a marshalling yard outside Amiens. The flak was heavier than expected, the clouds thicker. The squadron scattered. Hanlon and Carter's bomber drifted off course, flying alone at 14,000 feet. "Radar's blind," Carter muttered, tapping the screen. "We're invisible again." Hanlon didn't answer. He was watching the contrails ahead, German F-190s closing fast. The crew tensed. 2, then 4, then 6 enemy fighters began circling like sharks. "Stay level," Hanlon ordered. "Don't give them silhouette." The fighters dived, guns blazing. Tracers sliced through the clouds, white and red lines of death. None hit. Every pass fell just short, the gunners misjudging distance in the haze. Hanlon's voice stayed calm. "It's working." Then, a burst. One shell tore through the right wing, setting the outboard engine ablaze. Smoke filled the cockpit. The co-pilot shouted, "We're hit!" Hanlon's response was almost serene. "Feather the prop. Keep her level. They'll think we're done." Below, the German fighters circled again, cautious now, expecting the bomber to drop. When it didn't, they pulled back, low on ammunition. Hanlon used the moment to climb, straining the remaining engines. "We're heading home," he said. The crew stared at him. "Sir, we won't make the channel." Hanlon smiled. "You'd be surprised what a ghost can do." For 2 hours, the crippled bomber limped across France. The fire died. The gauges wavered, then steadied. No radar contact. No interception. Just the endless hum of engines refusing to quit. When they crossed the English coast, fuel gauges read near zero. Hanlon circled once, then landed on fumes. The landing gear collapsed on touch, but everyone walked away. The ground crew ran toward the smoking wreck, shouting. Carter looked back at the blackened fuselage, shaking his head. "Sir, that's not possible." Hanlon lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly. "Neither was paint that could make you disappear." That was his last flight. 2 weeks later, he was transferred to logistics, his record marked unorthodox but effective. Black 13 was scrapped quietly for parts. But the story wouldn't die. Across bases in England, crews began calling damaged bombers that made it home ghost ships. Some said Hanlon's trick was passed to engineers working on radar-absorbent coatings decades later. History never recorded it as innovation, only as legend. But among those who lived it, the math was simple. One man's defiance had turned fear into science, and desperation into survival. The final entry in Hanlon's logbook read, "Mission 23. Crew returned safe. Plane held together. Proof enough." By the fall of 1944, the war had changed, but William Hanlon had not. He still believed that innovation wasn't born in laboratories or from committees, but in hangars, under grease-stained hands and sleepless nights. Yet while his peers were earning medals, Hanlon earned silence. The Air Force didn't know what to do with him, a man whose brilliance embarrassed the chain of command. He was assigned to aircraft recovery, a polite exile that kept him out of headlines. Every week, damaged planes limped back from France, their wings shredded, their fuselages burned. Hanlon walked through the boneyards at dawn, running his fingers across the scars in the metal. To others, they were wrecks. To him, they were proof. In the autumn cold, one of the younger mechanics approached him. "Sir, is it true your bomber couldn't be seen by radar?" Hanlon smiled faintly. "Not invisible, just misunderstood." He never said more, but that small answer spread through the base faster than any rumor of glory. By Christmas, half the mechanics in East Anglia were dulling paint with soot and oil. Hanlon coating, they called it. The colonels hated it, the pilots swore by it, and though no memo ever confirmed it, radar logs from Luftwaffe command units began noting something odd. Allied bomber groups were becoming harder to track in dense weather. Hanlon's name never appeared in the reports. It didn't need to. The legend was already airborne. Years later, after the war ended, he returned home to Kansas. He found work repairing tractors on a farm outside Wichita, a quiet life for a man who'd once outsmarted the Reich's radar. Sometimes a former crewman would visit, bringing whiskey or stories. They'd sit on his porch watching the sunset. One of them, Sergeant Ferris, asked him once, "Do you ever regret it, sir? Breaking orders?" Hanlon didn't answer at first. He looked toward the horizon where the clouds were turning gold. "Regret? No. Orders end wars. But ideas, they start the next ones." He took a slow drag from his cigarette and added, "If a man waits for permission to do the right thing, he'll wait forever." Ferris nodded. "You know they're using your math now. Some engineers said they're testing radar coatings. Called it absorbent material. Sounds a lot like what you did." Hanlon chuckled softly. "They'll call it something better. They always do when it works." In the decades that followed, the technology evolved. Paints became polymers. Radar-absorbent coatings turned into stealth composites. Engineers at Lockheed and Boeing studied declassified reports on reflectivity anomalies from World War II, notes handwritten by a Captain W. Hanlon. They never called it the Black 13 principle, but that's what the old veterans did. In their reunions, When they toasted to lost crews and impossible missions, someone would always raise a glass and say, "To the man who made bombers disappear." Hanlon died quietly in 1979, at home. No fanfare, just an obituary in the local paper. William A. Hanlon, 63, veteran of the 8th Air Force, mechanic and innovator, survived by his wife and 2 sons. But in Air Force archives, buried under technical reports and mission debriefs, one sentence from 1944 still stands out. Unapproved surface treatment applied by Captain Hanlon showed unexplainable results under radar exposure. Further study recommended. That study never happened. But the idea never died. Hanlon didn't just fix a plane. He fixed a problem no one had dared to name. The problem of fear. He'd proven that courage wasn't only flying into flak. Sometimes it was daring to question the manual, to challenge the doctrine, and to make something the world wasn't ready to understand. And for one brief moment in the sky above Berlin, when Black 13 vanished into the storm, the impossible had become visible. Long after the war ended, when the last B-17s were scrapped and the factories fell silent, the story of Black 13 refused to die. It was whispered in hangars, remembered in squadron bars, and repeated in classrooms by young engineers who grew up hearing that one man had made a bomber vanish over Berlin. In 1958, the Air Force began experimenting with radar-absorbing materials for reconnaissance aircraft. The project was called Rainbow. Among the documents referenced was an obscure 1944 field note titled, "Observations on Surface Reflection Reduction, Captain William Hanlon." No one in the new generation knew who he was, but his math lived on. Ratios of pigment density, soot composition, and field angle testing. What had once been dismissed as unauthorized tinkering was now a cornerstone of modern stealth theory. Engineers at Lockheed's Skunk Works, the birthplace of the U-2 and later the SR-71, would rediscover the same principle Hanlon had discovered by accident. That sometimes the best camouflage wasn't color, but absence, the art of taking away light. They called it optical diffusion. Hanlon had called it common sense. Meanwhile, in the small Kansas town where he was buried, a group of local veterans petitioned to have a small plaque placed at the county airfield. It read simply, "To Captain William Hanlon, who believed that ideas fly farther than orders." His wife, Margaret, attended the unveiling with their sons. She stood silently as the local honor guard saluted, then whispered, "He never told me what he did, only that one day he made the sky listen." Back in England, the field where Black 13 once took off had been turned into farmland. But every spring, when the soil turned and the sunlight hit the right way, locals said you could still see faint black streaks across the ground, like shadows refusing to fade. Military historians often debated whether Hanlon's ghost bomber was fact or fable. The official records remained vague, yet too many witnesses swore the story true. Radar logs showing anomalies, Luftwaffe after-action reports describing a phantom formation, and one German pilot's diary that mentioned a black bird that could not be shot. To the pilots who flew the real missions, it didn't matter if the story had been embellished. They believed because they needed to. In a world ruled by orders, fear, and attrition, Hanlon's defiance reminded them that human imagination still had power. In a lecture decades later, an Air Force historian summarized it best. "When rules fail, innovation saves lives." Hanlon's sin wasn't disobedience. It was foresight. Even the word stealth, born in the Cold War, owed its spirit to him. Every radar-absorbing alloy, every invisible aircraft, every black triangle streaking across the modern sky carried a piece of his ghost. Today, when B-2 bombers glide over the horizon, matte, silent, untouchable, they are not just machines. They are the descendants of an idea born in a small English airfield under a single dim lamp, where one mechanic mixed soot into paint and refused to ask for permission. Hanlon's legacy isn't written in medals or citations. It's written in the math of survival, The math that says one man with courage and a wrench can alter the path of history. And perhaps that's why his legend endures. Because in a war defined by destruction, William Hanlon built something no bullet could destroy: belief. As the veterans of his generation faded away, one phrase still appeared on reunion banners and memorial walls: for those who flew through the storm, and for the man who made the storm blink. In the end, Hanlon didn't change physics. He changed perception. He proved that even in the loudest war humanity ever fought, the quietest victory of all was learning how to disappear.